Welcome back to part 4 of our video lecture for chapter number 1, where we're going to be talking about dependents. Dependents are important because they may determine whether the taxpayer can be a head of household filing status or possibly a qualifying widow filing status. In this section down here of the 1040, we would have to list out the names, social security number, and the relationship of the dependent to the taxpayer. Dependents can be classified into two broad groups. One is called qualifying child, and the other is called other qualifying relatives. And in addition to the filing status, the taxpayer may be able to claim tax credits. Tax credits for these dependents. And we'll talk about more tax credits than these two mentioned here in our next chapter, chapter number 2. But let's take a look at our textbook to see the discussion about dependents. Again, there's two categories, one of them being qualifying child, and you need to meet these tests to be a qualifying child of a taxpayer. These last two, filing a joint return if the dependent is married, and being a citizen or resident of the U.S. applies not just to qualifying child, but the other category I mentioned, the other qualifying relatives, both have to meet this last two tests. But let's take a look at each of these tests for the qualifying child. The first one is that the qualifying child has to be related to the taxpayer. And it's not just necessarily son or daughter, but here you can see other close relationships as a child to the taxpayer, including grandkids, grandchildren to the taxpayer. Even younger brothers or sisters of the taxpayer may be eligible for this relationship. Even nieces and nephews of the taxpayer meet this relationship test for being a qualifying child. Let's take a look at the next test, and that's for the age of the dependent. The dependent has to be under age 19 at the end of the tax year, or under age 24, but a full-time student during one semester during the year. And full-time is determined by the rules of the school or the college. So for example, in the UH system, as long as a student takes 12 credits in any one semester, they're considered to be a full-time student for the year. And if under age 24, they would meet this age test to be claimed as a dependent child. The next test is residency, and not residency in the US, but a resident, a dependent as a resident with the taxpayer for more than half the year. Doesn't have to be the whole year, as long as it's more than 6 months during the year. Here it says temporary absences from being in the home of the taxpayer due to maybe being in the hospital or away for school or even in the military is just considered to be temporary, and still at that time you're considered to be living with the taxpayer for tax purposes. Support test is not what most people think. You would think that the support test is the taxpayer supports the child, the dependent. What this is saying here is that the child, the dependent child, is not supporting him or herself by paying more than 50% of the support costs. If the child is paying more than half of their own support costs, you don't meet this support test. Again, it's not logical. We're not talking about the taxpayer supporting the child. We're talking about the child supporting him or herself. And if the child is supporting him or herself for more than 50%, you do not meet the support test. And the taxpayer cannot claim the child as a qualifying dependent. Let's move on to the next test. And here it says, and this also applies to all dependents, not just qualifying child. The dependent can be married, but they shouldn't file a joint return with their spouse. You probably should be filing a separate return. Now, if you do file a joint return and you save $1 in taxes, then you cannot claim this married dependent as a dependent. So typically you'd want to file a separate return for your dependents. And this test also applies to all dependents. The dependent has to be a citizen of the U.S. or a resident of the U.S. or a resident of Canada or Mexico. Okay, so this has to be true for your dependents, no matter if they're qualifying child or qualifying relative. So here's the second category of dependents. If the person is not a qualifying child or relative, then you test whether they meet this test for qualifying relative. So again, you have a relationship test, a support test that's different than the support test for a qualifying child. And here's a test that isn't applied to a qualifying child called gross income test. And the joint tax return for a married dependent and citizenship test is the same as we saw before for a dependent. So the relationship can still be like we saw before, could be son, daughter, brother, sister, grandkids. But now you can go upwards, ancestors, parents, grandparents. You can have your aunt or uncle by marriage, not by marriage, but by blood being meeting the relationship test. Even nieces and nephews can make the relationship test. Also, in-laws, mentioned here, meet the relationship test. What you don't see on this list is cousins. And here in Hawaii, we say everybody is a cousin, yeah? But that doesn't meet a qualified relationship to meet this test. Let's talk about the support test. Now, this is the most logical test that people think when you claim a dependent. The taxpayer has to pay for more than half of the support costs for the dependent for the year. So that probably will include stuff like housing, food, education, as mentioned here. And as long as the taxpayer pays for more than half of that cost, the this test is met. Now, the dependent doesn't have to live with the taxpayer like a qualifying child, but to get this lodging support costs, pretty much they have to live together since we have a high cost of living here in Hawaii. If no one person provides more than half of the dependent's support costs, the people that do provide the support can get together and agree among themselves using this rule and have one of the um, taxpayers considered to be paying more than half the support costs meeting this test. Now, another test that may be difficult for older dependents to meet is this one called gross income test. If the dependent has taxable income, earned income they earned during the year of more than $4,200, this disqualifies them from being a dependent. Again, this is for not qualifying child. A qualifying child doesn't have to meet this gross income test. This is for other dependents, all qualifying relatives. If they have more than this amount of income for the year, they cannot be claimed as a other qualifying relative. Now, in the case of a qualifying child, remember that first group, they can have $1 million of income because there's no gross income test for qualifying child. It's for qualifying relatives, you have this gross income test. Now, what's sometimes confusing is the difference between income That's what's being earned by our dependent. And the support costs, this is what's being paid out by the taxpayer. Yeah, again, going back to this section over here. Support costs. Income is money coming in, being earned. Support is money going out, paying for support costs. Okay, so don't confuse the two. I think that's the only test we need to look at for claiming dependents. Now, in the case of people that are not related to the taxpayer, they still may be able to be claimed as a dependent. Again, one of the tests was relationship, yeah, for the two different categories. But if a dependent is not related, as long as they live in the same household for the entire year with the taxpayer, they can meet the relationship test. Yeah, this is an exception to that relationship test. You don't have to be related as long as you live in the entire home for the whole year. So an example would be, let's say, a boyfriend or girlfriend, unrelated, not married, living together. So you don't meet the relationship test, but as long as you live in the same home for the whole year, you can consider the relationship test met for uh, other qualifying relative. You still have to meet the other test for other qualifying relative. Let's take a look at our Laulima resources folder. And remember, here in this resources folder, there eventually will be subfolders for each of the chapters we're assigned during the semester. So for our first chapter 1, you can see lots of links here in the subfolder, including, let's see, this one here, test to claim a dependent. You can download this publication from the IRS. Let me go to the cover. This is quite a good publication from the IRS that's used by volunteer tax preparers. You can just Google IRS publication 4012. And what's nice is that there's a table of contents that's clickable. So here's all of the topics that we still cover in our class, including right now one for dependents. So if I click on this first link for dependents, it goes through the same tests we talked about in our textbook. Here, this first bullet here says that if you're a dependent, you cannot claim someone else as dependent, which kind of makes sense, right? And if your dependent is married, they usually cannot file a joint return. So probably they should be filing a separate return. If they do file a joint return and save in taxes, that will disqualify them from being claimed as dependent. If they don't save any taxes and get a refund but don't save any taxes, then they still would qualify. So the best thing to do is to file a separate return for that dependent. And the dependent has to be a U.S. citizen or a U.S. resident, that's green card, or a U.S. national, possibly someone born in American Samoa, or here, a resident of Canada or Mexico will also meet this test here. And that applies to both qualifying child and qualifying relative, those two different categories. So here's the relationship test for qualifying child. And here's relationships, including ancestors for qualifying relatives. So you always test for this one first. Yeah, this is the better one. And if they don't meet the qualifying child dependency rules, then you test them for qualifying relative rules. So the qualifying child has the age rules, has to be under age 19 by the end of the year, or under 24 but a full-time student, or here permanently disabled. All of this would meet the age qualification. Then the dependent child has to live with the taxpayer for more than half of the year. Sometimes we call this the residency test. And then the support test here for number 4. It's not whether the taxpayer supports the child, it's whether the child supports him or herself for more than half of the support costs. And if you say yes here, the child supports themselves, then you cannot claim this person for the support test, for the qualifying child dependency. And here we talk about again the joint return of the dependent. You cannot usually file a joint return. And here it just says that only one person can claim a dependent for this qualifying child. If more than one taxpayer meets this other test here, then those taxpayers can agree among themselves who will claim the child as a dependent. If they cannot agree among themselves, then typically it's the custodial parent that has first rights to claim the child. So again, you always test first for qualifying child, and then if not eligible, you try to test that person to be another qualifying relative. Again, there's more relationships than son or daughter. Again, ancestors, aunts, uncles, niece, nephews. And if you have no blood relationship, as long as that dependent lives in the same household of the taxpayer for the full year, then you meet the relationship test. This is the relationship test area. And then there's a income test, gross income test. If the dependent has more than 4,200 of taxable income for the year, like wages, interest, dividends, and so forth, then you don't pass this gross income test and you cannot claim the person as a qualifying relative dependent. And here's the support test. Not the same support test we see here for a qualifying child. Here's the more logical support test where we're saying that if the taxpayer pays for more than half of the support costs of the dependent. Okay, so this is just a summary on this one page of the two different dependency rules. Now, if you want to get a little bit in more detail, you can go through the next page, which is pretty much like a flow chart, and it goes through yes, no questions. Pretty easy to answer. And at any point, it'll tell you to either move on to the next question or it says to stop because you're not going to be eligible to claim that person as a dependent. Okay, so this is the end of part 4 of our video lecture for chapter number 1, dealing with dependents. I'll probably have one more video talking about who is required to file a tax return for the year.